I am very excited to introduce Raymond Arsenault, the John Hope Franklin Professor of Southern History Emeritus at the University of South Florida. He is the author of several award-winning books on civil rights history, including Freedom Riders, 1961 and the Struggle for Racial Justice, The Sound of Freedom, Marian Anderson, The Lincoln Memorial, and The Concert That Awakened America, and Arthur Ashe, A Life. Today he will be discussing his latest book, John Lewis, In Search of the Beloved Community. For 6 decades, John Robert Lewis was a towering figure in the U.S. struggle for civil rights. As an activist and progressive congressman, he was renowned for his unshakable integrity, indomitable courage, and determination to get into good trouble. In this first book-length biography of Lewis, Raymond Arsenault traces Lewis's upbringing in rural Alabama, his activism as a freedom rider and leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, his championing of voting rights and anti-poverty initiatives, and his decades of service as the conscience of Congress. Both in the streets and in Congress, Lewis promoted a philosophy of nonviolence to bring about change. He helped the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders plan the 1963 March on Washington, where he spoke at the Lincoln Memorial. Lewis's activism led to repeated arrests and beatings, most notably when he suffered a skull fracture in Selma, Alabama, during the 1965 police attack later known as Bloody Sunday. He was instrumental in the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and in Congress he advocated for racial and economic justice, immigration reform, LGBTQ rights, and national health care. Arsenault recounts Lewis's lifetime of work toward one overarching goal, realizing the beloved community, an ideal society based in equity and inclusion. Lewis never wavered in this pursuit, and even in death his influence endures, inspiring mobilization and resistance in the fight for social justice. Please join me in welcoming the author, Raymond Arsenault.
Well, good afternoon. It's the first time I've been back to the store since 2006. I did a talk on my book, Freedom Riders, and I had a great experience, and I'm sure it will be the same today. This is the fifth talk that I've given on the book since it came out about a month ago, and I must say it's been really rewarding. I knew that people had invested a lot of feeling about John Lewis, but I don't think I ever fully understood it until the other night I was giving a talk in my hometown of St. Petersburg, Florida, and more than 300 people showed up. And it was in a church sanctuary, and they sold out all the books, and there were people standing, and it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. I'm curious at the beginning, how many of you have had the good fortune to meet John Lewis? Oh, wow, that's great. Wonderful. That's terrific. I always want to know sort of what... Oh, up a bit. Okay, here we go. How's that? Is that better? Sorry. Yeah. I always like to know what the audience brings to the talk, and years ago when I was at a conference at the Smithsonian at the National Museum of American History, there was a woman scholar, well-noted scholar. The conference was on Native American history, and she was neither Native American nor an expert in Native American history, so she was clearly nervous in giving this opening talk. So she told this story about an historian who drowned in the 1889 Johnstown, Pennsylvania flood. And the story went that, you know, he got up to heaven, checking in with St. Peter, and all he wants to talk about is the rushing waters and the flood and how awful it was. And St. Peter's just trying to get him checked in. So he sort of tolerated him, and he wouldn't give up. He kept going on about the flood. And at some point he said, I can give a lecture on the flood once I get checked in. I'd love to give a lecture on the flood. And he wouldn't give up. Finally, St. Peter said, okay, you can give a lecture, but I'm warning you, Noah will be in the audience. Okay. So I've discovered over the years there are always Noahs in the audience who maybe know more about the topic than I do. But it's good to see that some of you have had that personal connection to John. I feel very fortunate that I had a friendship for 20 years with him. I never got to spend enough time with him. Every time I did, I felt really privileged and honored, because I don't know that I've ever known anyone so extraordinary, frankly. I've been very blessed with meeting a lot of wonderful people, but John was different, really different in a fundamental way. I met him in 2000 when I was researching my book on Freedom Riders. And so I went to his office in Washington, and I really didn't know what to expect. I knew a lot about him, but I didn't know what he'd be like personally. And his warmth just washed over me. He was almost without ego, frankly. He had this kind of selfless style about him. I made the mistake of calling him Congressman Lewis, and he said, "Get that out of here. Everybody calls me John." And in the years that followed, I discovered that he tried his best to be considered to be one of the foot soldiers of the movement. I mean, he was a leader, certainly, but I don't think he ever felt totally comfortable in that role. I think part of the reason was that he was so young when he got involved. I think we sometimes forget that. Some of you may remember that a couple of years ago, they made a big point that he was the only surviving speech maker at the March on Washington. Everyone else had died, and he was the only one left. And then you realize that he was a full generation younger than anybody else on that podium that day in August 1963. But that was just part of a pattern for him. He had his first protest when he was 16. He's still in high school, and he was a voracious reader from the time he was a young boy, which is striking because he lived in utter poverty in Pike County, Alabama. They had no running water, no indoor plumbing at all, no electricity. The roads weren't paved. He was one of 10 children. They essentially were sharecroppers, and one of the reasons I think that he was so desperate to go to school and to get out was that he didn't like farm work very much. He didn't like to chop cotton. Maybe some of you have heard the story that he was given the job by his parents of tending to the chickens, and he decided that early on he wanted to be a preacher, and so at 6 or 7 years he started delivering sermons to these chickens. He'd line them up, and he swore later that they paid attention to him. They listened. They actually were somehow affected by his speechifying. And part of it, if you've heard him speak, he had a slight kind of speech impediment, and he had a very deep Southern accent as well, South Alabama accent. And he was a bit self-conscious about it. I mean, if you met him just in polite conversation, he was quiet. He was kind of gentle. But he was a very forceful speaker. Once he got on the platform, he never needed a microphone, frankly. Quite extraordinary. But I think that was part of this speaking to the chickens, was to try to perfect his oratory. But I was saying about the 16-year-old, nobody in his family had ever been to high school, let alone to college. There were very few books in the house, so libraries, particularly the school library, was really important. But black education in Alabama in the 1950s, they got virtually no funding, and so he thought, well, I'll go to the public library, and so he goes to the public library and he asks for a library card, and of course they throw him out on his ear. The library in Pike County was for whites only, they informed him. And I think with a lot of kids, that might have been the end of it, but not with John Lewis. So he writes up a petition. And he tries to get his classmates in the all-black school to sign it. And he finds out that most of them wouldn't sign it because they were scared, frankly. It was kind of a reign of terror in Pike County. You didn't take that kind of protest lightly. He got a couple of his cousins to sign it, and he sent it in. And of course, hoping to get some response, he never got any response. Okay, so that was his first protest when he was 16 in 1956. So years later, he wrote, maybe you're familiar with it, a wonderful memoir, perhaps the finest memoir I think ever written by a civil rights leader, called Walking with the Wind. Walking with the Wind. It was published in 1998. It was a New York Times bestseller, runaway bestseller really for a couple of months. And so, wouldn't you know, the Pike County Public Library decided to invite him as their honored guest. Now he's a published author and a best-selling author. So he agreed to come. And, of course, he gets up there, and immediately his first thing is he says, I want a library card. Okay? And he didn't leave until he got the library card. He really lived long enough to see at least the social conventions change in the area of Alabama where he grew up. Troy University would not accept his application. It was no black had ever been accepted to Troy. This was in 1956 as well. And at that time, Autry and Lucy was trying to desegregate the University of Alabama, and he knew about that. And so he actually visited with Dr. King in Montgomery and Ralph Abernathy and their attorney, Fred Gray, and to talk about applying to Troy. He was already in college, by the way, at American Baptist Theological Seminary in Nashville. And he was there because they had no tuition. You could simply work for all of your funds. And he did so for the 4 years he was at American Baptist. But when he got there, he discovered that there was no interest at all in the social gospel. I mean, he had already responded to Dr. King, or a radio sermon that he heard in 1956. And of course, the Montgomery bus boycott was going on. A whole community was rising up in nonviolent direct action. Never happened before in the American South. It thrilled him, and it sort of educated him in the power of the social gospel. He never read any of the social gospel philosophers, but he sort of absorbed it in his personal philosophy. And when he got to Nashville, he found that really none of his teachers, certainly not the president of the college or any of the fellow students, had any interest in the social gospel at all. And he was really discouraged, and he decided, well, maybe I'll do something on behalf of civil rights. I'll break the color line at Troy State. And so he met with Dr. King, and I think for a whole afternoon, and Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy were trying to convince him, we want you to do this, we'll support you, we'll fund you, but you got to know this will put your family at risk. The White Citizens Council then was often anybody who was discovered to be a member of the NAACP, for example, could very likely lose their job, lose their mortgage, lose their farm, or worse, kind of physical intimidation. He said, I want to go forward anyway. And he went back and he actually convinced his parents for 24 hours that he could apply to Troy. And the next morning they changed their mind. They said, look, we just can't risk the lives of our other children. And he respected that, and so he did not apply to Troy. The city of Troy was about 10 miles from their farm, but I don't think he actually went to Troy until he was 7 or 8 years old. He's totally isolated. But Dr. King labeled him the boy from Troy, and for the rest of his life he was known as the boy from Troy. And it's really hard to figure quite how he internalized this belief in the beloved community, which of course was a phrase that Dr. King used quite often. It actually goes back to 1913 to the religious philosopher Josiah Royce. was later adopted by the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which was the leading pacifist organization in the world. And many religious philosophers, Howard Thurman, who was Dr. King's kind of religious mentor, and Gandhi used the phrase. And it's kind of a simple concept. It's utopian in a sense, and the notion that somehow you can create a world without division, a world that's unified, where everyone has equity and justice, and people don't prey on each other. So that became his lifelong quest. And at age 19, he started participating in sit-ins. His first arrest, the first of 45 arrests in his lifetime, including 5 when he was a congressman. He suffered his first beating. He suffered more than 40 beatings. And you may remember later in his life, he lost all of his hair in a kind of shiny dome, and you could see almost every scar. And he sort of bore the marks of all these beatings. The worst of them, of course, was the beating on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965. He led 600 marchers across the bridge, trying to begin the march towards Montgomery. And of course, the state police and the local sheriff's deputies were there waiting, and they nearly beat him to death that day. Many people were injured. He suffered a fractured skull and was in the hospital. But a few days later, they actually got the possibility of actually marching the 52 miles to Montgomery. And he had no business being out of the hospital, but he insisted that he march every day. So he would march as far as they would go, and then they had somebody to drive him back to the hospital. He'd spend the night in the hospital, and then he'd come back to wherever they were between Montgomery and Selma. I think he didn't want to ask anybody to do anything that he wasn't willing to do. You know, he was always sort of putting his body on the line, which makes it even more extraordinary that he lived to be to the age of 80, really. It was, I think part of it was his attachment to Gandhi and Gandhian philosophy. Gandhi talked about unmerited suffering as an important part of the process of adopting a philosophy of nonviolence, of nonviolent direct action. And for John, it wasn't just a strategy or a tactic. I mean, it worked, right? They filled the jails, they wore out the Jim Crow criminal justice system, but John was after a much deeper transformation than that. He actually didn't even like to use the term civil rights movement, and many historians today don't use that term because we like to think of it as a kind of a deeper struggle with the hearts and minds of people, a kind of social, cultural, philosophical transformation. So when they got the Civil Rights Act of 1964, with public accommodations, and the Voting Rights Act in 1965, those were great victories, but that was just stage one. Someone like John Lewis. In fact, as you probably know, because later in the decade, there's a lot of disillusionment, which fuels the Black Power movement and the Black Panthers and others who realized that the struggle for jobs and freedom was by no means over. You might have the right to get a hotel room or order a meal in a restaurant, but you might not have enough money to do it, frankly. And so there was a lot of sense that the response of the Congress in passing these laws was so difficult. You know, it was so much resistance that I think for a lot of blacks said, well, you know, we're not sure we want to join this club. You know, that American politics was not such a bargain after all. John never felt that way, but I think he was very clear that even though, ironically, he became the one civil rights leader to make the transition from protest to politics. Now, Jesse Jackson did as well, but Jesse Jackson never, of course, won the presidency that he was seeking. John served 17 terms in Congress. And there was a great leader named Bayard Rustin, which you've probably heard of. There was actually a made-for-TV movie that Michelle and Barack Obama funded as executive producers the other night, which I didn't like the movie very much, frankly, I have to be honest. I didn't think it really did justice to Barrett Rustin. But Rustin came out with this rather extraordinary article in 1965, same year as the Voting Rights Act, where he said, it's time for us to make the transition from protest to politics. That if we're ever going to really see freedom in this country, we're going to have to do that. We're going to have to run for office, not just vote, but actually run for office and get elected and sort of fight from within, not just from without, which shocked people because Rustin, of course, had been the leading Gandhian intellectual in the United States. I mean, he was known as an extraordinary organizer of protests, but he's the one who's saying, enough. We can still protest, but we've got to make the turn to politics. And early on, in the early 60s, the Kennedy administration was very, very nervous about nonviolent direct action. They found out they couldn't protect the marchers and people doing the sit-ins and protests, and they wanted somehow to stop the violence. You know, in a Cold War sense, it looked awful. Headlines all across the world that people were being beaten just because they wanted to sit in the front of a bus or sit at a lunch counter or just anything kind of trivial. So they, through Harry Belafonte, they siphoned funds to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and other groups to encourage them to focus on voting rights. Of course, you can see an administration like the Kennedy administration, it's a win-win for them. You know, they're going to get more votes, and there won't be as much, they thought, as much violence against voting rights activists. It turned out they were dead wrong, that the voting rights, people tried to register people to vote, like in Freedom Summer in Mississippi in 1964. I'm sure you've heard of Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, who were murdered the first week they were in Mississippi. It didn't stop the white supremacists in the South. They didn't care whether it was voting rights or anything else. But the Kennedys believed it. And so they were trying to put pressure on the movement leaders to change their emphasis, to stop filling the streets with nonviolent direct action and to move towards voting rights. And John was one of the ones who was really skeptical initially. He was one of the ones who said, I don't like this pressure the Kennedy administration is putting on us. I want to stay with nonviolent direct action. They finally decided to split SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, into two wings. In fact, John's roommate and best friend, Bernard Lafayette, who's still around, I appeared with him 2 nights ago, and I'm going to appear with him next week in Montgomery at the Freedom Rides Museum. He said even a bird needs 2 wings to fly. And that was sort of the way they agreed to compromise. But it's always seemed ironic to me that John Lewis, who becomes the most distinguished, if you could say, voting rights advocate in the United States, initially didn't really want to focus on voting rights. He wanted to be out there in the streets. But he was so, again, what I was saying a few minutes ago, he was so young. Think about it. He was 21 when he became a Freedom Rider, one of the original 13 Freedom Riders. There were eventually 436 Freedom Riders, but he was on that first bus. And he was the victim of the first violence on the Freedom Rides, which took place in Rock Hill, South Carolina. They'd been on the road for a week. They were thinking, well, this is not going to be so difficult after all. Then they came into Rock Hill, which any of you have ever been to Rock Hill, South Carolina, it's a pretty tough town, even today. Kind of cotton mill people who always felt like everyone looked down upon them, and they had a lot of grievances to try to express. And so this gang of Klansmen showed up at the bus station when they came in, beat 3 of them, particularly John, very badly. This is the first time you see him in the pictures with bandages all over his head. Half of the pictures, I think, in those years, he has some kind of bandage on his head. You know, he was the leader. That's how you could identify him. You know, he was always getting beaten up. But in this particular case, one of the Klansmen who beat him up was a 24-year-old man named Elwyn Wilson, kind of a Klansman in training. And but he was the one who really lit into John that day. And later in his life, Mr. Wilson left the Klan, got religion, got married, had children, kind of got his life together. Was no longer so angry, at African Americans. Always felt guilty, though, about what he'd done to John Lewis. So in 2009, at the first inauguration of Barack Obama, there's John Lewis sitting in the front row right behind the president, president-to-be, president-elect, when he took the oath of office. And you could see him very clearly. Maybe some of you remember that. Maybe some of you were there, actually, in person. So Mr. Wilson, on a whim, he calls John's office, congressional office, and asks to speak with him. And John was always so accessible. He almost never said no to anyone. And he didn't say no to Mr. Wilson. So Mr. Wilson gets him on the phone, and he's crying and sobbing and saying, "I'm so sorry. I can't believe I did that to you back in 1961. I've always felt guilty about it." And as John tells the story, they started praying together and crying together. And I think with most people, that would have been the end of it. Mr. Wilson got to apologize. Well, not with John Lewis. He flies him up to Washington to have a kind of come to Jesus meeting. I must say, 3 nights ago, I gave a talk like this in a synagogue in Brookline, Massachusetts. And I used that word, come to Jesus movement. I thought, maybe this is not the best place to talk about that. But anyway, so he goes up to Washington. They become friends. Simple as that. So 2 years later, 50th anniversary of the Freedom Rides, my book on the Freedom Rides was made into an American Experience documentary by Stanley Nelson, who's a quite extraordinary filmmaker. And it won 3 Emmys and a Peabody. It's been seen by more than 60 million people to this point. Oprah, they gave her a DVD. She should have known a lot more about the Freedom Riders than she did. Her father is a barber in Nashville who had many of the ex-Freedom Riders as his clients. Somehow she'd missed it. And she watches the movie and she's just overwhelmed by it. She calls Stanley Nelson about 15 minutes later and says, "I only got 4 shows left in the Oprah show. I've got to devote one of them to the Freedom Rides." And sure enough, she did. She flew 180 Freedom Riders in with their families, financed this whole kind of 50th reunion that we were having. But Oprah's Oprah, and she knew there were dark aspects of the Freedom Rides, right? It's kind of these people are nearly killed. Many of these kids made out their last will and testament before they got on those buses because they didn't expect a return. That Oprah wanted some kind of reconciliation story. So she said, I met with the producers, and she said, "Have you got a reformed Klansman we can put on the air, during the show? Just lighten it up a little bit, little leaven." And of course we said, "Well, sure enough, we do. There's Mr. Elwyn Wilson." And so he came on the show. He was absolutely terrified, but he agreed to come on. He's a man now in his 70s. He was uneducated. He knows there are tens of millions of people watching this show. The entire audience is filled with Freedom Riders, the people he beat up in 1961. So you can imagine how nervous he was. So I'm sitting in a chair, and then John's to my left, and then Mr. Wilson's to his left. I'm off camera, but I'm right there. I can see what's going on. That Mr. Wilson was about to implode. He was just panicking. So Oprah asked him the first question. Nothing comes out of his mouth. She tries again, and it was like he was going to bolt from the stage, literally. He was so terrified. And John, almost instinctively, I guess, reaches out and grabs Mr. Wilson's hand with his left hand. And in a voice that everybody could hear in the studio, "He's my brother." It was such an act of compassion, of generosity, really. I don't think there was a dry eye in the house that day. I tear up even now thinking about it. It's probably the most extraordinary thing that I've witnessed in my lifetime. But there you had John Lewis, really. So compassionate, so kind, and a man who nearly, fractured his skull. And it was sincere. I mean, one of the elements of the nonviolent philosophy, which is the most difficult one, I would say, that Dr. King tried to perfect and that Gandhi believed in. You need to love your enemies as much as you love your friends. Simple as that. Now, in this day and age, I'm sure many of you have found that extremely difficult. I have. How divisive and some of the awful things, the threats to democracy that we're facing. And I must say, the times I spent with John, nobody could make me feel guilty more than he did, because I mean, it had a tremendous impact on my life, and I really tried to step up my activism and my just behaving the way I should as a nonviolent person. But I could never live up to his standards, and particularly when it came to loving your enemies as much as you love your friends. But that's who he was, really. And for him, I don't think it was difficult. I mean, because there were others, of course, in the movement who deeply believed in nonviolence. But I think he's the only one that I know of, and I got to know many of them, who never wavered. There was never a doubt. Tell you just one more story, and I'll open it up for questions. So he's in Selma in 1965. It's before the Selma to Montgomery March, which thousands of people eventually participated in. And Dr. King is checking into a hotel that had never had a black person stay in that hotel. So John's right next to him, and then in comes this notorious white supremacist Klansman and starts punching Dr. King in the face and doubled him up. And who knows how far he was going to go. But here's little John Lewis. He was strong, but he was short. He puts a bear hug around the man and stops him. And then, of course, I guess the police came, or somehow they got the man away and they arrested him. But the way John tells this story, he said, that's the closest I've ever came in my life to a fight, a physical fight. He had a certain amount of guilt that he knew he did the right thing, but he thought there was a certain amount of disjunction between his preaching nonviolence and grabbing that man, physically restraining him. So that's, in a sense, that's how I think deeply he felt these beliefs, and not everybody agreed with it by any means within the movement. I mean, he never really embraced black power. He never embraced black nationalism. He was very proud of being African American, and loved his family and all the people he grew up with in Pike County, Alabama. But very early on, he sort of made the transition from civil rights to human rights. He was an internationalist, spent a lot of time in Africa, and the whole, as Claire said in the introduction, he supported the whole range of progressive issues. He was an early environmentalist. He was very much involved in immigrants' rights, LGBTQ, same-sex marriage, before almost anyone else in Congress. So he was really out there in a sense. But for him, there was no problem, really. There's no other way he could live. He was the real deal. And I think I wish we still had him with us. I've been asked at several stops on this author tour about is there another John Lewis that's likely to come by? And the closest I can think of is, you may have heard of Brian Stevenson, who runs the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, who's been funding all of these memorials to lynching. And I heard him give a lecture a couple of weeks ago, the likes of which I have never heard in my life. I mean, he really is the new John Lewis. So we'll hope it'll become infectious and we'll have more than one. But I really do feel very privileged and honored to have been able to spend so much time with John, and particularly in writing this book. Thank you.
So, questions over here. Is this on? Yep. So the last time I saw you was at the museum in 2011 with Standing Nelson. John was there. You're promoting the Freedom Riders, and the Freedom Rider truck was the bus was
The bus,
outside.
yes.
So recreating it for a new generation. There were a whole bunch of young new Freedom Riders recreating. I imagine for African Americans in general, John has always been, in the top of the history they're taught. For I'm thinking a lot of white people, can you say the significance of the March series, the graphic novels that came up, and how powerful was that in terms of John Lewis's reputation?
I don't know how many of you know about the March series. He did 3 volumes. It's essentially his life story, but telling the story of the movement during his years. And then he wrote, actually, a 4th was published posthumously called Run. The 3rd volume won a National Book Award. First time a graphic book had ever won. It sold incredibly, and his idea was that he wasn't going to live forever. We know now know he didn't, obviously, but he wanted to somehow influence the younger generation. And he had a man on his staff named Andrew Aden, who was very much into cartoons and graphic novels, and convinced him actually to go to Comic-Con, this kind of convention of people who are interested in animation and things related to that. And the rest of the staff made fun of John for doing this. They really thought it was ridiculous that this congressman was getting involved in this. But of course, he had the last laugh. They did these books, 3 of them. They were, of those kind of books, they were runaway bestsellers. And I think they're part of his legacy today, that a lot of young people will probably never read my book and maybe no other adult book, but they know about March. So he knew something the rest of us didn't, I'd say. He was very spontaneous. I always found him. He loved freedom songs, but he couldn't sing very well. But he really loved to dance. Maybe you've seen some of those. They're YouTube things of him dancing in the halls in Congress. He really didn't mind sort of people making fun of him, because he was so beyond that, And as he once said, well, particularly after he ran against Julian Bond, his best friend, in 1986 for Congress, everybody thought Julian would win. Julian was suave and good-looking and a kind of national figure. And as John said about himself, many, many times, I'm not a showboat, I'm a tugboat. I'm not a showboat, I'm a tugboat. And so people didn't give him a chance in winning that election, but he did, and of course was never defeated. After a few years, the Republicans just gave up running against him in Georgia. He was unopposed most of the time for his 17 terms. So I think the March thing was a really important.
Yes. As someone who works here and is here on my day off, I should say that if folks are interested in the March books, I'm not going to say they're a substitute for something like Parting the Waters or any of these excellent nonfiction books people have written about the subject, but they are very wide-ranging. There's a lot of great material in them. For young people, it's a really useful means to learn more about it. And if you want to see how this stuff gets interpreted as comics, it's a great book series to read. So absolutely recommended. However, that's not actually why I'm standing here at the microphone. I just thought I'd point it out. So the media has an interesting tendency of kind of taking people's lives and squishing them down into something that's more palatable to people. It's something you'll see with something like Greta Thunberg, where she lives her life like pushing people to do something about climate change, and then they put out like a book you can buy for $10 about her life, right? Or someone like Martin Luther King, how he can be someone where he really pushes people in this country as to how they live their lives, what they think should be normal. These days, you have like the FBI, the Republican Party saying like on Martin Luther King Day, oh, it's Martin Luther King Day, this is great. When I think, as we all know, back at the time that King was living his life, they would have either wanted to kill him or get him out of the way. Now, with someone like John Lewis, absolutely like a hugely important figure, someone who had a giant influence on everyone around him, and in his time was also a pretty amazing guy. I'm wondering, as someone who's a scholar of history and someone who writes biographies and interprets this kind of story, do you have any thoughts about sort of the process of like capturing someone on a page, how you get to the reality of the person, the difficulty of sort of capturing the story and not sanding it down for an audience that might expect a certain thing?
Not dumbing it down.
Yeah.
Well, the difficulty with John is that to this point, there are no personal papers, which was a real challenge. I think Michael Collins, who was his chief of staff, has a body of papers, but at this point, they're not available to scholars. So I couldn't quite do the interior story that I wanted to, although I knew John so much I could try to certainly humanize him, but I had no letters, for example, no personal letters. So that was a real difficulty. There's one documentary film called Good Trouble that you probably have seen. It was done kind of quick and dirty. It's not bad. There's some good interviews, but it really doesn't do him justice. I mean, you get a sense of who he was, but it's just a fraction of the story. And having been involved in the making of Freedom Riders, I know what a first-class documentary can do, and I certainly hope that they'll be able to do that for John. And there's I brought this up. This is one of the good children's books. It's called Preaching to the Chickens. Okay? And I brought this in part because tomorrow morning I'm going to speak to my granddaughter Poppy's pre-K 4 class, and I'm going to read this to them. That's pressure, okay? They're 5-year-olds, and but there have been a number of those kinds of books that have really, I think, for real young people, can sort of prepare the way for a deeper understanding. Although you probably are familiar with John Meacham's book, which he did, came out just after John died in July of 2020. And actually, when I was beginning this book, it's for a new book series by Yale University Press called Black Lives. And this is only the third one to appear. And actually they wanted 200-page books, and the first two complied, but there was no way in the world that I could deal with the complexities and the nuances of John Lewis's life in 200 pages. Historians are kind of hoarders of words, right? And difficult for us to write anything that short. But in Meacham's case, the book came out. I said, "Oh my God, John Meacham's written a book. Do I really need to write this?" Maybe I'll pick another Black life to do for Yale. And then I got John's book and John Meacham's book, and it's very good, but it stops in 1968. The last 52 years are missing. He does an 11-page epilogue. And much of the great story in John's life is making the transition, the unlikely transition from protest to politics. Many people thought he was too utopian, too pie in the sky to be able to be an effective congressman. And I think he proved them wrong, that he was willing to deal with the pragmatic politics. Perhaps he wasn't the best person at compromising. He certainly didn't compromise his moral principles, but he knew it was important with his constituency in Atlanta to get things done for those people. And he was as hard a working congressman as I think we've ever seen. He never missed any votes, even though he had all kinds of other responsibilities as kind of the leader of all these civil rights reunions. He's always flying all over the place. I don't know how he did it. But he was so deeply committed. And it's shocking to me that they used to have, I don't know if they still do it, they used to have votes on the most admired congressperson. And he would win every time. Every time. Even the conservative Republicans would support him. Say, I don't agree with anything he says, but here's a man with the deepest of integrity and moral and physical courage. And they had to, I think, acknowledge that.
Thank you very much. That's a wonderful presentation. I had the good fortune to meet John Lewis at a J Street meeting here in Washington about a few years ago. I had a different experience. I went to a town called Bogalusa, Louisiana. You know about Bogalusa?
I do indeed.
Bogalusa, Martin Luther King or John Lewis, or none of the ministers would come to Bogalusa because it probably formed the first Black Power organization in the country before Oakland did in 1966. And
you're talking about the Deacons of Defense?
The Deacons.
Yeah.
And I went down actually as an individual physician to help in desegregating the health system for CORE and the Medical Committee of Human Rights.
Oh,
and James Farmer was there. But Bogalusa was so violent, it had the most violent Klan in northern Louisiana, southern Mississippi, the Klan that killed those 3 kids, that I never understood how John Lewis's position would ever survive in Bogalusa. Bogalusa had a civics and voters league to try to negotiate with the administration that never got formed. It had 6 white people who tried to negotiate, and they were all forced out by the Klan. And so I got to know the leaders there, and I really identified with the ability to defend oneself physically. And so I've thought about this in this moral dilemma. I really admire the ministers. I think their position helped to negotiate with the federal government and become tolerable for the white community. On the other hand, if these people, I feel, did not defend themselves, they'd be killed. And they were killed. And they were killed after I went there.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think John realized that nonviolence would not bring about what he wanted in every case. And although as the chairman of SNCC for 3 years, he did encourage SNCC to go into the toughest towns in the South, Macomb, Mississippi, for example. And he was all for that. He was one of the really pushing for that. Bogalusa was sort of the extreme. And actually, when I was doing the Freedom Rider book, it was 2001, and after I interviewed John, just a month later, I did my first really formal interview with 2 of the Freedom Riders, Bernard Lafayette, who was John's roommate, and Ben Cox, known as Benjamin Elton Cox, known as Belton Elton. He was a minister. And the night that Medgar Evers was killed, June 12th, 1963, a lot of people don't know this, but there were actually 3 people targeted that night: Ben Cox, Bernard Lafayette, and Medgar Evers. Now, Bernard was in Selma, the first parts of the voting rights struggle, and he was very badly beaten that night, but he survived. Ben Cox was known as he's a lovable man, but he's sort of a space cadet. He was never where he was supposed to be. So the assassin couldn't find him that night. So Ben survived. So here I am knowing nothing, and I'm doing my first interview with Ben and Bernard, and I haven't even asked my first question yet. And this was in New Orleans, and they were just laughing. I thought, are they laughing at me? I didn't know. And I said, what's so funny? And what they had remembered is that for years after they were targeted on that June 12th, 1963, they would send each other Death Day cards, what they called Death Day cards. That was the day they were supposed to die. And I mean, that kind of dark humor is what helped them get through it, frankly. And that's what they were laughing about. But I never forgot that. But Bogalusa, wow. Ben Cox was in Bogalusa. and he made the mistake of talking about sit-ins, stand-ins, swim-ins, and love-ins. And that's what got them, because they thought he was advocating interracial sex and interracial marriage. And basically they targeted him for death, and he did escape, thankfully, that night.
The man in whose house I stayed the second time, I left and then I went back to, was murdered 6 months later for taking me into the house.
Wow.
And people, the first black policeman who was in the middle of 65 was murdered. And it was only after John Doerr went down at the end of 65 that they had a federal case against the Klan. And everybody in the police was in the Klan, as well as the town prosecutor. So I felt that if these people didn't defend themselves,
sure,
this was nothing to negotiate with. It wasn't turning, and it just didn't fit into the national model, and that's why it was essentially ignored as seen as a violent place.
Yeah, I mean, the movement really couldn't withstand too many defeats. They were essentially defeated in Albany, Georgia in 1962, when Dr. King had to leave without getting the demands met. The whole community of Albany went into the streets and got arrested, and it ended up almost with nothing. And that's what set the stage for what was called Project C, Project Confrontation in Birmingham. They risked everything in Birmingham, thinking that they could take advantage of the fact that Bull Connor, who was perhaps the most open white supremacist, violent leader in the South, that if they could get him on tape, get him on TV, and of course
which they did.
That's right. So he brought out the attack dogs and the fire hoses and his tanks, and the rest is history, so to speak. That Birmingham was really the great turning point in the history of the movement. But they had to be very careful. I mean, in some ways, where Dr. King was going was kind of staging, these media presences. But Bogalusa was one of the communities where, after the Freedom Rides was so successful everywhere else, the Justice Department brought a suit to desegregate the buses, and it just didn't work. Even though Bogalusa politicians lost, but it still, people were not desegregating transportation there years after the decisions were rendered.
Bogalusa was a place where the community attacked the few white people, including,
Sure.
And forced them out.
Yeah.
With the plan.
Well, they were traitors to the white race, right? That's how they were seen. They were the most vulnerable of all.
Including ministers,
Yeah.
editor of the newspaper, and the owner of the radio.
Yeah. I will say that John was never, in my experience and what I've read in my research, was never self-righteous about opposing self-defense. I mean, he couldn't do it himself, but he understood completely people like Bogalusa. But I think he didn't get involved directly, in a sense, because he thought he would lose his credibility. He was asking people to do something that was incredibly difficult, and he didn't want to kind of confuse things. But he certainly was supportive of armed self-defense.
If you do short pieces, I think you ought to do a piece on this gentleman's adventures in Bogalusa. This would make an excellent
Absolutely.
short piece if you do something besides write books. I did see the PBS American Experience special, and I thought it was terrific.
The one on the Freedom Rides?
Yes.
Yeah.
My late husband was a civil rights activist. He went to teach. He graduated from Harvard in 1967, and before that was before I knew him. Went to teach in the South in the summer. His name was Marty Slate, and after he finished law school, he worked at the EEOC from 1970 to 1982. He got up to number 4,
Wow.
and he was there until he was let go by the then obscure official Clarence Thomas. My question is, shortly after 3 years or something, John Lewis was unelected from SNCC. Yes, and I wonder why that was and how he felt about it.
He says biggest disappointment of his life.
Mm-hmm.
He threw everything into SNCC, but he knew that he had lost touch with the kind of rank and file, that there were a lot of people who no longer believed in nonviolence,
right,
even though the name was still there, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and they particularly had lost faith in interracialism. There were a number of people
right,
who wanted to throw all the whites out of SNCC, and they did,
right,
after he left.
Black Power.
In fact, you may have heard about this controversy in Boston this week. I didn't know about it till I was about to get up to speak in the synagogue the other night, and one of my friends took me aside and said, "Did you see the Boston Globe story today?" I said, "No." And what happened, there were two groups at Harvard, pro-Palestinian groups, I guess,
right,
of some description, who used, they recycled a SNCC cartoon from 1967, when John was long gone. He never had anything to do with anything like this. And it shows the Star of David with a swastika in the middle and two ropes, and there's an Arab figure being hanged and a black. And so I was afraid that someone was going to ask me about it. I had to explain that, you know, this was the post John Lewis SNCC. SNCC virtually fell apart in 1967 and 1968, and Stokely Carmichael took over for John. They had been friends, but Stokely was he personally had sort of given up on nonviolence and on interracialism, and he wanted to be chair, and he basically set John up. And John was reelected, and they called it was a procedural thing where they had, into the night, they had a second election and they de-elected him. And he was incredibly discouraged by this, although it may have been the best thing that ever happened to him in a sense, because it forced him into work with the Southern Regional Council and with the Field Foundation, working anti-poverty. He kind of spread his wings and was traveling some of the poorest communities in the United States for the next few years, and then became the head of the voter education project. And so it freed him up to do all kinds of things, and he became an Atlanta city councilman, and then finally, of course, running for Congress. SNCC wouldn't have lasted much longer anyway, but before that, many SNCC kids had grown tired of Martin Luther King. They thought he was too ministerial, too old. He was young, but too old for them, and too stuffy. And after he refused to become a freedom rider in 1961, I mean, he'd raise money for them, but his aides wouldn't let him get on that bus to Mississippi, and he might well have been killed. He knew that. But John was the one who never broke with King. He served on the board of directors of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the organization that Dr. King established in 1957. And it was very controversial in SNCC. They wanted him to get out. They didn't want him to speak at the March on Washington either. In fact, they didn't want him to lead that march across Emma Pettus Bridge. They didn't want to have anything to do with things that King was doing. So the movement was really split at that moment. And he was trying almost the impossible to keep one foot in SCLC and one foot in SNCC. But the center wouldn't hold in the end. And it was just a matter of time before they got rid of him. But again, you know, as I said, you talk to him, he's kind of mellow, quiet, but he had fire in his belly. I mean, it was just a level of determination. You look in his eyes. That's the first thing that struck me. His eyes, his dark eyes, just you knew that you're dealing with somebody who's not a normal human being, frankly.
Interesting. Do a piece on Bogalusa. Talk to this guy. Marty was a big civil rights activist, and I never heard about this.
Yeah.
That.
Thank you. It's good advice.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our author for a really great event, a great discussion with our audience.